So Walter Isaacson and I are very happy to see all you tonight, and we're so excited that tonight we had a great opening session, the first half of it anyway. And it's not lost on me at all that all of our guests tonight were sons and daughters of the South. And I'm so honored tonight to be able to introduce two of those sons and daughters of the South tonight. Imani Perry, the beautiful writer of South to America, who wowed us all with her New York Times essay on New Orleans recently, and Dr. Ellie Glaude Jr., the author of Begin Again. We're so thrilled to hear you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much. I think I'm still on fire from the last panel. Are you?
Absolutely. It was a master class.
It was a master class for sure. I want to thank President Fitz. I want to thank Cheryl and Walter for all the work that you've done to make this an extraordinary event. We also want to give a shout out to the invisible labor, the people behind the scenes who are making all of this happen. And we also want to acknowledge that there are some folks, even as we're enjoying this Mardi Gras Festival of the Mind, that there's some folks who, over in Ukraine, who are experiencing the barbarity and cruelty of war. We want to acknowledge what they're facing. We also want to acknowledge the very sad fact that close to 1 million of our brothers and sisters aren't here with us today because of COVID-19. So we want to lift them up in this moment of joy, right? We want to acknowledge and recognize them. I'm so delighted to have a conversation with my closest friend, Dr. Imani Perry.
That is mutual.
You know, we're both professors at Princeton. I'm a student of hers. What you might not know is that over the last 2 years, she has produced 5 books.
Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration.
No, we're talking...
Since 2018.
Looking for Lorraine, the pen biography of Lorraine Hansberry, May We Forever Stand, a history of the Black National Anthem, winner of the American Studies Award, right?
Do you want me to say the rest? I wrote a bunch of other books, yes, but this one holds a special place.
Yeah,
in
Breathe,
my heart.
Vexy Thing,
Yes.
whole range of books. So
Yes.
let's talk about South to America. Let's just jump right into it. You argue in the book that the South is the heart of America.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, in one frame of reference, right? You know, there's multiple. How you tell the story of where we begin as a country is a complicated thing. But wherever it began in the South, right? Because, you know, the various European empires come to this land, see all of this incredible abundance in the age of exploration and the age of conquest and the age of the transatlantic slave trade. And they're negotiating on this land, this region, because of its abundance, right? And that abundance geographically, and also, you know, so what happens is there's the moving out of indigenous people. There is the taking of people and their labor, African people. And then there's this building, and which, you know, there's successive waves, but that starting point shapes so much. And it shapes so much, and I think it's really important because part of the book is arguing against, I think, the way in which the South becomes the repository for the nation's sins, right? And so what I'm trying to do in turning that on its head is say, no, this was possible, or this thing was made because of what was here and how it could be used. And so at every moment, whether you're talking about 1520 or 1619 or even 1776, because the Revolutionary War debt could not have been paid without the South, which is why DC is, you know, depending upon one's perspective. But in the South, why the capital had to be in the South, right? The Electoral College, the way we do, our very politics are structured. I spent many, many days in my life reading Federalist 54, right? What basically is the argument for the structure of the country. And it's all about, well, how do we satisfy the desires of the planter class in the South, right? But that becomes a norm of how that becomes a norm of how we structure things in this country. So my argument is that it's the source, and at the same time, because of all of that, the greatest freedom dreams come out of the South.
The greatest freedom dreams come out of the South. Now, we're using the phrase the South.
Yeah, it's a complicated
But
word.
you complicate that. Say a little bit
I
about
had
the
to.
South.
Well, I will say, when I began, there are many places that I did not think of as the South, that I was...
This is that Alabama snobbery of yours, I see.
Right. This, you know, like, I mean, even North Carolina is called upstate in Alabama, right? And I lived in Maryland, and I never thought of Maryland as the South until I started working on this book. And I had these experiences where I knew intellectually, right? We teach Frederick Douglass every year, right? Was enslaved in Maryland, right? Harriet Tubman, right? So the idea that I couldn't even conceive of Maryland as the South was interesting, right? Because my conception of the South has to do with King Cotton, right? And the movement down into Alabama, the Deep South in the early 19th century. But really, Souths exist because there are waves of productivity, right? And that have to do with the environment, but industries that develop and are grown, right? So Maryland, yes, there's tobacco, right? We have sugar, we have cotton, and so every place was shaped by the landscape, right? The culture, the fact that there are Souths plural has to do with what the land gave, right? And how it shaped people and shaped relations.
But you even find yourself in Florida, South Florida, the
I do.
Bahamas. Say, wow, why? What do you...
Well, okay, so it starts with this question. I go to Bahamas and I'm like, why do they eat grits for breakfast? There's an answer, right? Because Bahamians are largely the descendants of South Carolinians who fought for the British and became free after the Revolutionary War, or the War of 1812, two successions, right? And also Haitians. But the point was, so that's like sort of a story, but the point was really about how it's really important to understand that this region, right, that I think of the kind of the circle, and I go around to Havana and Bahamas and around the, you know, the Gulf Coast, is that to understand it as having once been one region, with the same sort of global powers navigating around it. And so there were people who were being moved in and out, moving and being moved in and out for generations. So when we talk now about you know, immigration from Central America, part of what I want to show is that's not actually new, that there is a back and forth, right? There's the same, and that's the case with the Bahamas. That's the case with lots of parts. And so when I'm talking about South Florida, for example, part of what I want to trace in the relationship between Central and South Florida is actually there is this long history of Jim Crow. And even with multiple immigrant populations, the relations of race, right, and property are sustained, right? Because part of the thing that's interesting to me is even when different people come in and out, if the structure is the same, then we do have to think about what's the structure.
Right. As I was listening to John Grisham, I was thinking about South to America. I'm trying to get to some place, but I want to walk a bit there. And the way in which he talked about it at the end, about knowing the through line,
Yeah.
about knowing the end before you write the first sentence. The entire book, in my view, is captured in the opening scene of the book. Talk a bit about this dance.
Well, the book begins in New Orleans, for those who don't know, and it begins with one of the balls celebrating or, you know, commemorating the Louisiana Purchase and conflict between the French and the American folks at the ball over so the way that the French and the English dance quadrilles was different. And the English quadrilles took a longer time, right? They have more steps. And so this ball, a conflict arises because it's the French turn to play a French song, and they say that the English quadrille isn't done, and so the English are like, no, one more song, and so it becomes this melee, and it gets really violent, right? And it's sort of like, it's sort of ridiculous because they're fighting over dance, but obviously they're not just fighting over dance, right? And then I switched from that to talking about this concept of the political quadrille, which was a concept that had currency in the 19th century. That's about the negotiations over this land, right? So we talk, because we have this habit in the United States of telling, it's different here, right? And literally in Louisiana, it's in some ways it's the most unique because of the history of the Napoleonic codes. You get more of that history of like the sort of the negotiations between European nations, but most of the country, it's a very linear British history in the story of the country. And you forget, right? But those negotiations between those world powers are happening simultaneously with this complex array of multiple indigenous nations and and Africans coming from multiple nations and languages and cultures. And so I wanted to capture, right, this negotiation of power and also this incredible array of human beings. So I also go from there to Congo Square, where there's different dances being danced.
Yeah, and it's reflective of, I don't want to call it a method, but it's a way in which the book moves. It's not stream of consciousness.
No.
But it's association. You move, you get the dance of the quadrille, then we get to the political, and then we get to there are these associations that you then take to, so let's talk about this. Talk about the form of South to America.
Yeah, so there's Easter eggs all over the book.
Yes, everywhere.
And one of them is in Birmingham, which is my birthplace, Joe Mentor's yard. He's a yard artist, a kind of a folk artist is what people tend to call folks like Mentor, but in some ways that term, in some ways it suggests a kind of diminishment. He's an incredible assemblage artist, and so there's like sculptures all over this garden, and it's a yard that is several acres, and then there are two historic black cemeteries that are adjacent. And you walk through the yard, and there's scriptures, and there's scenes, and there's tornadoes in various places, and so it is an experience to move through this yard. He has put together an experience, right? It's not like a curatorial project in a museum, right? But it's actually, so there is the it's a movement through multiple senses and stories, and it's an effort to actually undiscipline the idea in the book of a travel narrative. It's deliberate undisciplining because, and this is very influenced by something that you said years ago, where you were talking about the choices of where we pay attention matter. You can attend here or you can attend there. And I wanted to attend in regular places. I wanted a series of encounters. And then you go someplace and you encounter someone, then you dig underneath the soil, right? And get a sense, what happened here? What's behind that phrase? Why do I feel uneasy? And that is not just an intellectual question. That is a sensory question. It's something you feel. So sound is important, texture, color, tension, which is, there's a lot of tension. There's these moments that are very tender, and then they veer, into difficult terrain, because that's how that's, in some ways, that is the everyday, right? It's the zeitgeist of so much of Southern experience.
Right.
This kind of,
the sentences in South to America are extraordinary. They're lush. They're beautiful. When I read it, it reminds me of my experience with Emerson, where each sentence is a universe unto itself. Right? If you read Emerson for an argument, you get lost. So you have to pay attention to what he's doing in the sentence or with the sentence. your sentences are doing this sort of work. And then, as you say, it's in this converse. So you're really thinking with the genre as you're writing. So there's Albert Murray here. There's V.S. Naipaul here. There's Joan Didion here. There's this amazing rewriting of Du Bois's Visit to the Black Belt in the book. Talk a bit about the sentences and the folks who you are in conversation with.
So, I don't know, this is a hard question to answer. I will say this, you know, I wanted to be able to bring readers with me who would not necessarily agree with every argument I might make, but I wanted them to be able to trust me. And so there's a nakedness to it. I am fallible. I'm ornery in some parts, right? I'm opinionated.
Yes.
Yes. And but I'm not making arguments in those moments very deliberately because, you know, because I want the reader to come with me to see these places and to potentially be moved, but even if they don't have to come to the same conclusion as I do, but I want them to look differently perhaps and to feel. So one of the ways I've been thinking about this is, you know, so sugar is a theme everywhere, right? But so the academic part of me could have said, oh, make an analysis of why, you know, Southerners consume more sugar than people in other regions. But whatever. But I wanted to explain what was happening in the moments when my grandmother would say to me, put some more sugar on your on your cereal, baby. Put some more sugar on, right? What that was about, and that wasn't about an addiction to sugar. That was about offering me some sweetness and tenderness. And that sweetness and tenderness mattered because the world is often cruel, right? It was a kind of softness, right? And I wanted to understand that sensibility, but also connect it to what it means to have so many people living hard scrabble lives in the South, right? And so to do that required something like the Associated, because I need people to be able to go, right, because it has to get out of argument to feel that, you know, to go with me, to have the experience of, okay, well, right now I'm deep down in the earth where you can't see, and somebody's just, when I'm in a cave in Maryland, and it's pitch black, and the woman who's guiding us is like, you stay down here long enough, you'll go blind, right? And everybody is kind of like, right? And to feel the tension of that moment was important for me later in the book to get to think, when we start thinking about miners, right? Deep down in the earth, and then later again when I have an encounter with a man who's driving me around Birmingham who was a miner for 30 years. So all through, there are these sensory experiences that I'm trying to make the reader have so that they trust me, you know.
So the sentences aim not only to convince, but to compel, to make you feel.
Yeah, to
right?
move.
Talk a little bit about one of my favorite chapters, of course, the chapter around Appalachia. I loved when you talked about, you put a little sugar on your cereal, baby, a little sweetness in the context of a hard scrabble life, Mountain Dew,
Yes.
moon pies. Talk a little bit about the way in which you give an account of that.
Well, that's the story. Mountain Dew, of course, is named.
Sweet as you can get.
It's right. So that the soda is named after, the moonshine hooch, right? Or the moon pie. The story, it might be a bit apocryphal, but they ask him what would it be a good lunch for a miner, RC cola and a pie as big as the moon, right? That's the sort of story. But again, that's about needing the drive to go for such a long day, right? That sugar kicks in and lets you, and of course for me, it also connected. My grandmother used to talk about her grandmother feeding all of the men who worked on the farm at this long table, and the kitchen was a separate building, and the meat hooks hung from the ceiling, and this long table, and just feeding them because they were going to be in the fields all day. right? And I think so. So for me, it's about, you know, you have every experience like that, right? So that every moment like that in the book happens at least 3 times. You have told me about Trinitarian. See, I've learned so much about writing from this man. You told me about the Trinity and why that's important in the structure of writing, and so. But any point that I'm trying to make happens at least 3 times. So.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the New Orleans chapter.
The New Orleans chapter.
Since we're in New Orleans,
Yes.
because it has an element of this, right? So there's this kind of, I'm paraphrasing the sentence, and I don't dare do it because it's such a beautiful sentence about the relationship between horror and New Orleans cuisine.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about not only the way in which you approach this place, but it's also deeply personal.
Yeah.
And that deeply personal aspect is throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
So talk a little bit about what informed the New Orleans chapter.
Well, I always describe this city as a phantom limb for me, because my mother was here as a teenager. She's a graduate of Loyola, at a time where there were very few black students at Loyola, and she described herself as being the only one who showed color. She was much darker than the other students. She was a member of the Sisters of the Holy Family Order of Nuns. My godmother used to be Vicar Superior of that order. And so and one of the moments I had is I realized late why my mother cooks differently than everybody else in the family. She always cooks with the Trinity, because she was here as a teenager, right? And so there are these moments, and my biological father, who I did not grow up with and don't really know, his family is from here, so I have all these addresses of places ancestors lived in the city. So there's a feeling of, and I talk about this in the book, of a kind of intimate connection as a draw, but I'm also very aware, and I say this, that it's not my home. And part of what I'm trying to do is push against the romanticism of people who say, I came to New Orleans and I fell in love and it became my home, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's incredible beauty, but there's so much suffering that has gone along with it, right? And there's something unethical about wanting to taste all of the beauty and get drunk off of it and not acknowledge that, right? You know, and so this is part of why, you know, I talk about the slave pens in the city, the violence of the fleur-de-lis, branding of black people who tried to escape, cutting off the Achilles, that's, you know, what decorates the city. And then, of course, you know, the persistent deep inequality, and the way that property, of course, shapes who gets to be where. And so the idea is, and I do this in other chapters in different ways, but the idea is to hold on to, yes, incredible beauty, incredible resilience, and also, if you want to drink from this font, you have to acknowledge the cost that's been associated. That's my perspective as an outsider, and what I'm trying to tell myself too. You know, and I say that as an outsider, even though for most, until, you know, I don't know, my sort of late 30s to 40s, I will come here every year with my mother, but very aware of it not being, you know, there's a distance there that I wanted to be ethical about.
Yeah, and you know, New Orleans people will tell these people who claim New Orleans that this is their home. They'll remind them quick of a conversation.
As they should.
Yeah, it's your home, all right. Mm-hmm. But anyway.
As they should.
Let me, there's a through line in the book as well. It's so deeply personal. It's your grandmother who's at the heart of it. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about her and why she's so important to South to
America. My grandmother, who we called Medea, and she was not like Tyler Perry's version. There's no relation. There's no relation there. Was a woman who raised 12 children, came from North Alabama, migrated to Birmingham, who it's hard to adequately describe her. I will say nothing that I've ever written, I say it differently, everything that I've ever written has had her at the very center of it. I have made a decision as an intellectual, as an artist, that I want to see through the experience. I want to look at the world through the experience of a woman who, you know, was born, lived most of her life through Jim Crow, Alabama, and a woman who was a voracious reader. She read every day, and a woman who cleaned people's houses, and a woman who had her second child on the floor of a rooming house because a doctor turned her away, dismissing her as a black woman. Had a baby on the floor of a rooming house by herself, and someone who had so much self-regard and invested all of us with an incredible self-regard despite all of the messages of the larger society. So she's at the center of everything and always has been, and of course then she is in this book.
It's not only her, it's the ancestor, Esther.
Yeah. So this is part of my Maryland thing. So I'm doing genealogy, which I should say I'm very skeptical of genealogy, which is a little weird, but obsessed too. Okay. But I'm going to start with my skepticism. My skepticism is that as someone who studies history, I feel like the past belongs to all of us. I think it's really important for us to feel comfortable finding our heroic figures, our models, our inspiration, without needing some direct connection to them. Anybody is a resource for us to fashion our lives and ourselves. So this is my skepticism, because I don't feel like I need a biological relationship to be like, you know, my kids tease me and they're like, you know, mom wants to be two different people. One is Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, and the other is old Cuban ladies with cigars.
That's so true.
Yeah, it's true. So I find this woman though. You have this romance in your head. So I'm like, I'm gonna find the person in one of these records, and it says so and so birthplace Africa, right? This kind of. And I found this woman, and it said birthplace Maryland, 1769. I'm like, Maryland, you know, because this is before I've had my transformation to understand that Maryland is part of the South, sort of. So and then it says her parents are born in Maryland. And so I start thinking, what does it mean to think about, okay, so now when I go to Maryland, I'm thinking, okay, this is a woman who worked probably in tobacco fields and watched this country be built formally without being considered, right? The structure of this nation is built while she's a witness. To me, and so if there's an argument, that's the argument, that's the story.
Right. So
from the outside, right? So that, yeah. And I just want to say one more thing about her, because I thought I found her. There's a document of someone, a runaway by her name, who is captured, and is a public notice because it says to her owner, you need to come here and get your negress. And it says that this woman said, well, they call me Esther, but my name is Stace. And I was just so captivated by by her claiming a name that's very different from what she is in the official record, right? So there's also this part that you can't know because the official records don't really tell the story.
You know, when I was reading South America, I was just so struck by the way in which you trace Esther, Stace, right?
Yeah.
Her relationship to your grandmother.
Yeah.
The way in which you claim the South, even though you were born in Birmingham, you were raised in Massachusetts, you got some Milwaukee in you, right? Chicago shows up.
Yeah.
But it's Alabama that
It's
is
home.
the constituent. It's
Yeah.
home,
Yeah.
right? And this is really key
Yeah.
to understanding the
Yeah.
exploration of the town.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. Also, somebody just emailed me like 2 weeks ago saying that they found more about this ancestor. So that's also the great thing about this book. They're like, I was in the Maryland State Archives, and I think I found her. Yeah, I'm like, okay, great. But Right. So one of the things, there's a couple of folks who, there's this, okay, so Romer Bearden, the painter, has this quote that just stuck in my craw where he said, I only ever left Carolina physically. It's North Carolinian. He left when he was 2.5. And, you know, I left a little bit later, 3.5. And then Gil Scott-Heron, you know, poet, musician, and he has these sentences where he talks about home. It was home for everybody I love. The word home is what we always used for Tennessee. Home was where my people I love were. Home was where everybody went to school. And that, so the word home, when I was growing, my mother would say, we're going home. That always meant Alabama. And I don't come from a migration family. My family is still overwhelmingly in Alabama. There's a few people, it's like 2 people in Atlanta, and there's like 1 person in Houston. But so we're also not a northern family. There's 1 person in New York, and my mother's in Boston. And we have a very large family. And so my sense of, it's not just, it's where I learned to, you know, walk, talk, read, you know, laugh, dance, all that. But it's also where my people are, where I'm regarded, where I'm always considered, where the people I know I can turn. I did an event in Birmingham last week, and, you know, it was just a tiny bit of my family, but it was a lot of people for the folks, and everybody was so delighted, because I said, you know, this room full of Perrys. And that's how we are. And the babies, you know, we haven't seen each other because of COVID for over 2 years. And these kids, you know, they're like 8 and 9, and they ran up to hug me. And that's the kind of bond. I think there's something cultural about it. I talk about this in the South being a place where family is a sprawl. You know, this sort of intimacy that is expansive. Yeah.
I was initially going to ask this last question to just have you think of, or just say a little bit about the way in which you framed the book. You have the quadrille, of course, but then there's the way in which you talk about the Puritans, but then you end with a Jeremiah. I was going to ask about that, but I don't want to ask about that now.
Okay.
I want to ask about South to America as risk.
Oh.
I've been up close to this book as you wrote it.
I said, I can't do this. Yeah. Yes.
It's an announcement of sort. Talk a little bit about what this book means for you as, not just as a scholar, but as an artist, as a writer.
Yeah.
That's your principal identity, isn't it, Professor Perry? A writer.
A writer.
Because we were over there just sniggling like little kids as John Grisham was talking.
Oh my goodness.
Well, go ahead.
Just over the
Just
moon.
overjoyed.
Yeah,
right?
taking notes. Yeah, I mean, so what does it mean? It means that, I'm going to say that, okay. It means that I didn't have to compromise what I wanted to do, and that's good. And what I mean is that I worked very hard for a long time to insist that I had a particular voice and that I didn't want to fit into prescribed boxes of how you had to compose something that was both intellectually and research informed, but also something that was supposed to get people in the gut. And so it's risky, but to me, what would be the point without the risk? You know, it's not, because it's the point, the driver is not the recognition. The driver is to be able to say, just share the things that I think I have to say, right? And so the risk, it's always been a risk. I've never done anything that wasn't risky. I've written 7 books. Every single one of them, people told me that's not the right way to do that. Everyone. And this time, thankfully, there are a lot of people saying, no, we're glad you did it this way.
It's a
Right?
New York Times bestseller.
Yeah, that's really great.
So with that, we want to open it up for some questions. I was going to say something else, but then that's not important. So we have mics over here. You say it out loud, and then I'll repeat it. You see what that other panel did? You see what it unleashed? Go ahead. Say it.
With your writing, do you find that you get a sense of healing of the experience of life?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question is, do I get a sense of healing with the writing? Sometimes I'm a mess afterwards. Sometimes my guts are all over the floor because there's some really painful stuff. And for me, one of the questions is, how do you tell the horror ethically so that you're not asking other folks to sort of be devastated and not have a way to digest, right? So, but I do think it's really important for every person to engage in exercises of how one tells one's story and to shake those up. Because we have, billions of facts in our lives, and we choose which ones we think are relevant to map to tell our stories. And sometimes those things, if we don't undo some of those, points in how we tell them, we don't get to important transformation. So I do think every time I write, that's part of it. Whether or not I'm in the work, that's part of it.
Thank you. Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is a pleasure to be here, and I would be remiss if I did not give Cheryl Landrew and Walter Isaacson their props, because this is something I've been waiting for since last year. And this is a question. Do you think there is a resurgence of what I would call a renaissance of black writers, or is the published industry finally caught up to what a lot of us has already known?
Oh, that's a great question. See, I was just going to say yes, and then I was going to say yes also. And I'd love to get your take on, because I do think that there are a bunch of extraordinary writers here too, and I won't embarrass them, but I do think that there is a renaissance happening. I think there's a particular renaissance of Southern black writers. I also think there's a renaissance of West African writers. I think it has something to do with grappling with how history is coming to knock us down right now. And I think that has to do with the environment. It has to do with the political landscape. And so people are trying to figure it out in a way that is not just, the sort of analytical piece, but actually the experiential piece, trying to sort of work their way through understanding how we might get closer to being in ethical relation to one another. So, I don't know, what do you think?
Absolutely. Yes and yes.
Yeah.
Maurice Ruffin, Sarah Broom. Sarah Broom, Maurice. I mean, we can just talk,
Yeah.
Part of what I love about their work, what I love about this Renaissance work in some ways is that it doesn't feel as if we're trying to write like generations before.
Yeah, it's really important.
Right. So when I read Jessamine Ward, I'm not trying to see if she's the next Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
Right?
But
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but that actually speaks to a point that we've talked about, which has to do with the second one, because we need to stop saying that the marketing of books needs to stop. This person has to be the next.
The next this or the next that. The Yellow House?
That's all right.
Yes, I love it. My daddy was a letter carrier. Second African American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. That's right.
Thank you both for being here. So happy to be able to bear witness to this conversation. My name is Dr. Tammy Lewis Wilborn, and I am also an author. I have a book coming out in October called Playing a New Game, A Black Woman's Guide to Being Well and Thriving in the Workplace. And I do have a question. As a historian, Dr. Perry, this is something I've been sort of wondering about. What do you think is the underlying fear that folks have about learning the fullness of our history? what are we afraid to find?
Yeah. That's a great question. And again, I would love for you to answer this as well. You know, one of the things that I think we need to confront is the dangers of living by myth. And that's across the board. That doesn't actually have one political logic to it. We want to tell noble stories, but I guess because it makes us feel as though we are legitimated, I think, in our present landscape and with the injustice in our midst in so many ways. Like I wonder about, this is a very basic thing, but every time I see someone who's living on the street, I wonder about how did we get to be like this, right? And so I think that the part of the way we get to be like this is the myths that we live with, that we tell about ourselves, that we tell about our world, our history, our past. And so once you begin to sort of undo the mythology and look at everything, including all the funk, right, it asks a lot of us about what kind of people we should be. And it's scary, right? And so I think that is the fear, and in the immediate moment, we have a particular kind of fever pitch of fear that's about banning books and banning words. But that's a slippery slope that I think we all need to think about, how we tell these sort of mythological stories. History is always messy.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking to you guys for the next 2 days. I don't need to talk anymore. But you know, at the heart of it, it seems to me, is what I'm calling a kind of American madness.
Yes.
Madness that has everything to do with these illusions and myths that allow us to live in a kind of false understanding of ourselves, right? And then the madness that it calls forward. Right? So it's not only the madness of denying who we are, but it's also the madness that
Clutching on, yeah.
that is the consequence. What else is double consciousness but schizophrenia? Yes. Right. So there's a consequence that follows from it, you know. So yes.
Hi, I'm Marissa Nathan Gersten. I'm a professor of communication, visiting assistant professor at Tulane, and I'll be speaking tomorrow about grief. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, this is amazing, and you're filling in so many gaps of what I know, and I'm really grateful to have your resources. I give my students a walking tour every year in alternative journalism of the Treme, and the tour was formed by Lolis Ellie. He gave me the whole tour and told me what to do. And we go to the Tomb of the Unknown Slave, and then we walk through to Congo Square. But I have a feeling that you might have, I kind of like know that all of us have more to learn. I wonder if, as people in New Orleans, if you have 3 like facts or secrets or places that we should all be conscious of to fill in some of the blanks in our history. It's a hard question, but.
I have too much sense to answer that question in a room full of people of New Orleans.
In a room full of New Orleans.
But I will say this. I mean, I do think that I think that those kinds of tours are really wonderful. I also think it's a useful exercise to also ask students to go places randomly and then dig underneath that location.
Okay.
Right? What's the story on this corner is another kind of exercise to flip in.
Thank you.
Yes. Could you go to the mic since you have your mask on?
You had discussed the concepts of sort of metaphors, use, and not hard delivering what you want to accomplish, using metaphor, parables. And I'm wondering are you getting at healing trauma through your work? Trauma to African American culture, and also education and healing of trauma of white culture.
That's a great question. I mean, I want justice.
Right.
You know, that's really the thing that's most
So
important
truth.
to me, right? But I will say that this book I appreciate your question, because part of what you're pointing to is, unlike many of my other works, this doesn't, it's not doctrinal. Like, I'm not saying this is what we need to do, A, B, C, and D, right? And that's a developmental thing for me, which is about, and again, much of this has emerged in conversation with you about, one of the things, in some ways, the vision is always a placeholder until we get to be the kind of people who can actually imagine together in a helpful way, right? So I'm imagining a vision, but and there have been people who, I say this thing that sometimes is responded to negatively, but I think about how do we become fit for the freedom we aspire to. And people think, oh, we're supposed to get free. We're already fit. But if we have been socialized to hoard, to be selfish, to be status conscious, to be hierarchical, to be mean, to be cruel, we could have a different social arrangement, and it won't last for very long, right? And as a more just arrangement. So I'm thinking, so it's about asking people to pay attention or to think about history or to think about human interactions or encounters in a way that is leaning towards being in better relation with one another with the ultimate goal. But it's hard for me to answer the question about healing, I guess because I don't know how possible it is in such, with so much violence and cruelty. We can get, like we can form some scar tissue, but we're all kind of wounded walking around here.
That's what I mean by
Put a little bit more
subconscious
sugar
trauma.
on your cereal.
Yeah,
baby.
that's
Yeah.
Can we thank Professor Imani?